Once again, thank you for joining our online service today. We're glad you're here and hope you'll come back every opportunity that you have. Please share any prayer concerns that you have using the prayer button. It's at the bottom of the screen if you're watching on a computer. If you're on a phone or a tablet, you might have to look around for it. Let us know how we can be praying for you or how we can help you in any way. Paul begins the next section of 2 Timothy like it's ripped from the headlines. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. On January 6th, we watched as an angry mob stormed the Capitol. We watched as the seat of democracy was overrun and trashed by this out-of-control mob OD'd on conspiracy theories and false rhetoric. A past unfortunate word choice turned out to be somewhat prophetic. Deplorables. We've seen it before, but before it's always been foreign dictatorships and banana republics. For the first time in a long time, we wondered if democracy can even work. Paul says, mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. And other times we might call this the plague or the scourge or maybe the Black Death. Pandemic sounds a little too academic for what has disrupted our lives so. Worldwide, more than 2 million people are dead, 95 million infected. The best way to battle it, wearing a face mask, has become a political football. Now there's a vaccine that can end the plague if we could just get it. At current rates, it'll take more than 8 years to get everyone vaccinated. Meanwhile, we're fast approaching 40,000 deaths in the United States. There will be terrible times in the last days. The headline after headline screams that we are living in terrible times. We must be living in the last days that Paul talked about, right? Well, we continue our study series this morning, Holy Fire, the message of 2 Timothy. Paul was writing to his protege in the final days before he faced his own execution. It's clear from what is written that Timothy's faith is being tested by Paul's imprisonment and approaching death. Paul says things to encourage Timothy and let us know that Timothy needs encouragement. He says, God does not give us a spirit of timidity, but of power. Or, so do not be ashamed of the gospel or of me, its prisoner, or fan into flame the gift of God, from which we get the title of our series, Holy Fire. Of course, we're looking at Paul's words to Timothy, and we want to know how they apply to us. And if anything speaks to us, it's this promise of terrible times in the last days. So let's look at 2 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 9, and see what the message is for us. Paul begins with this verse that should be very familiar by now. There will be terrible times in the last days. But what is the last days? We naturally assume he's talking about the end of the world. What else could it be? There's a lot of people that point to how bad things are getting today. Political unrest, immorality, the pandemic, Democrat selected to the White House. The last days must be upon us. How arrogant to think we're better at sin than at any time before us. When exactly has there been a time when the world has not been corrupt in multiple ways? I suggest that we need to understand this last days language in the way that it's used elsewhere in the New Testament. When Peter begins his Pentecost sermon in Acts chapter 2, he begins by talking about the last days. He says, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. The apostles were speaking in tongues. There were some people that thought, hey, they must be drunk. Peter says, no, this is the fulfillment of Joel's prophecy, that this pouring out of God's spirit that would take place in the last days. Peter says, in effect, on Pentecost, the last days start now. The pouring out of the Holy Spirit was his exhibit A to prove that. There are some today that believe that, well, there'll be a rise of someone called the Antichrist in the last days. And John writes in 1 John 2 and verse 18, Dear children, this is the last hour. And as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. This is how we know that it is the last hour. John says that the last days, even the last hour, had come upon them in the first century as he was writing. Many antichrists had already come and had already risen to show that it was the last days, he says. But who was this antichrist? He goes on to say, anyone who denies Jesus. Who is the liar? Verse 22. It is whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ. Such a person is the Antichrist, denying the Father and the Son. The last days that had begun at Pentecost will continue until Jesus comes. Paul makes sure that Timothy knows that terrible times are coming, but they apply to him. He ends by telling Timothy to watch out and avoid people. In verse 5, have nothing to do with such people. He describes the kind of folks that's going to be coming during the last days, and he tells Timothy that he must watch out for them. Paul's warning of the last days applied to Timothy as well as to us. No one knows when Jesus will return, so we watch and wait. Every Christian of all ages must live their lives as if it were the last days. All believers of every age and every era must watch for those terrible times that will come. What does Paul say is so terrible about the terrible times in the last days? I want you to listen and compare two different texts that I'm going to play for you. The first reading is his description here in 2 Timothy of the terrible times in the last days. The second is his description of the pagan Roman world of his own day. Paul was making the point in Romans that Jews and Gentiles are united in their need for God's grace. He'll argue that the Jews had the law, but they didn't really follow it. But first, he describes the pagan world that had denied its knowledge of God and had been led in all kinds of ungodly things. Notice how closely the description of Paul's pagan days matches his description of the last days. Listen.
People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. Have nothing to do with such people. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree, that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them.
Fyodor Dostoevsky once said, if there is no God, then everything is permitted. That's always been true. It's true today, but it's not more true today. The world apart from God has always been a world in rebellion against God. Are things getting worse today than they've ever been before? Well, that kind of depends on who you are that's measuring it and what you're measuring it against. Hitler killed 6 million Jews, Stalin 20 million of his own countrymen. But Genghis Khan and Mao Zedong may look at them and say, amateurs. Since Eden, the world has always been in rebellion against God. That's why Jesus came, because the world was totally broken by sin. And we shouldn't be surprised when the world looks broken and acts broken. It's still broken. But the most dangerous enemy is not the world out there. It's an enemy within. Terrible times of the last days will arise among us, within the church. The terrorist attacks in 9/11 drove the country together as never before. But the terrorist attack of January 6, by those who claim to be patriots, it was America attacking America. How do you defend yourself against that? Paul says that the they that would bring about the terrible times in the last days is really a we. Look at verses 6 through 9. They, the people that he's warning Timothy to stay away from, are the kind that worm their way into homes and gain control over gullible women who are loaded down with sins and are swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning, but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these teachers oppose the truth. They are men of depraved minds who, as far as the faith is concerned, are rejected. But they will not get very far because, as is the case with those men, their folly will be clear to everyone. You see, the real damage to the church, the real terrible part of the terrible times that will come from within our ranks. The false teachers would hold sway, Paul says, especially over what the NIV translates gullible women. The word that is used here in the original literally is little women. It's used as a pejorative. Women were uneducated and inexperienced in the first century, and their lack of training made them easy marks for these false teachers that were looking to gain a following. That's why Paul doesn't allow women to teach in the Ephesian church. Why does Paul stress that these women are loaded down with sins? Why does Paul start his warning of the terrible times by giving us a list of sins that we saw in verses 3 and 4? Why does he tell Timothy, have nothing to do with these people? Why does he end the list of the description of sins by describing them as lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying his power? Paul's warning here isn't pointed at the world, it's false teachers within the church. They gained a following by teaching people that they could remain in sin, that sin was no big deal. What is it that Paul stresses about these guys in verses 4 and 5? They were big on talk. They had a form of godliness, but they didn't know its power. They taught that sin was no big deal. They lived in all various kinds of sin and promoted that among other people. I know it's easy today to feel that things are getting worse and worse and that the end is near. But if we do that, we have a very myopic and self-centered view of history. An example, some think that the COVID-19 pandemic is a harbinger that the end of the world is coming. But the Black Death, the plague in AD 1347 through 49, killed 1/3 of the civilized world in Europe. 1/3. That must have felt something like out of the book of Revelation, right? Anything that we see as proof of the end time in our time can reflect other periods of history. In fact, there may be much better examples in other periods of history. The rise of abortion in our culture, in New Testament times, they fed their unwanted babies to wild animals as standard course. Persecution of the church today, yes, there is persecution in the church, but not in our country. In Asia and parts of Africa, people are dying for their faith, but that's the part of the world where the church is growing. Is the church weaker today than it was? In the West it is, in the United States. But the kingdom is advancing. The gates of hell still will not prevail against it. We could go on and on looking at the so-called proofs of the end of the world. The world isn't getting worse. It's always been worse. The question isn't, is the world getting so bad that the end is near? The question really is, the end is coming, so how are we going to live? If we believe that the end is near or coming, that should change everything. We shouldn't be wringing our hands with anxiety and angst. We should rather be busying ourselves so as to live as people who are ready for his coming. I mean, that is always the point when the Bible brings up the end. Look at 2 Timothy 3 and verse 11. Since everything will be destroyed in that way, what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives. That's the question, and that's the response. If the end is coming, we should live holy and godly lives. To be honest, I've never really understood the fascination that some have with the end of the world. Oh, I know Jesus is coming, but he's coming in 1,000 years or before lunch tomorrow. He is coming. But then again, I'm pretty sure the end of the world will come in 30 years or so for me. I'm 64 years old. I'm only middle-aged if I live to 128, and I probably won't. It would be great. It would be amazing. It would be wonderful to be here when Jesus comes, to hear the trumpet sound of God, to see Jesus coming in the clouds. But if I die before he comes back, hey, it's not the end of the world. What matters is how we live today, tomorrow, and for the rest of our lives. That we live for God and reflect his holiness as best we can. that we trust in Jesus for the holiness that we can't gin up within ourselves, that we repent when we see our lives looking too much like the world around us, that we join with God in trying to make this world a better place, that we live hopeful and joyful lives as we point others to our God. If we live that way with hope and love, we will be ready to rise up.